After meeting the mediocre obituary journalist Daniel in London, Alice Ayres, a recent newcomer, moves in together. While Dan is taking book release photos, he meets photographer Anna. Dan is inspired by Alice's story to write a book. The dermatologist Larry and Anna are married after Dan introduces them. Unfortunately, the couple's connection is complicated by Dan and Anna's intense affair. Because they were cheated on by their partners, so they sought revenge all night long. Dan is a young writer who is strolling around London City. He notices a young woman heading in the other direction with short red dyed hair, and they exchange smiles and looks at each other. Since she is not accustomed to automobiles in the UK driving on the left side of the road, she looks the wrong way and steps into traffic, getting hit by a car. As Dan rushes to her side, she glances up, greeting him as "Hello, stranger." Dan brings her to the hospital, where they begin to get to know one another, and she isn't seriously harmed, apart from a bruised left knee and some cuts and bruises. As they pass it on their way out of the hospital, Dan recognizes the park from his childhood. They walk past a wall bearing the names of law enforcement officers, firefighters, and anybody else who has sacrificed their life to save the life of another. After boarding the bus, they carry on their talk. We find out that Dan writes obituaries by day and is a wannabe writer. Alice Ayres is how the young American lady addresses herself. She says she's a New York City dancer who moved to London to get away from a toxic relationship. When at last they get to Dan's office. After bidding farewell, he turns around and leaves. To the question of whether he has a girlfriend, he says yes. After a year, Dan is having his picture taken by Anna at a tiny artist studio. Dan and Alice are living in one home together, and Dan is also an author of a novel about his romantic life with Alice. For the dust jacket of his freshly released book, Anna took his picture. American photographer Anna primarily captures portraits of strangers. She says she enjoys visiting aquariums and maybe snapping pictures of individuals there. She tells Dan that she and her husband are currently not together. He finds out she read and enjoyed his novel. They two kiss one another, and she finds out that he has a girlfriend and that she is the inspiration for the book. She breaks up the kiss just as he is admitting how much he loves her and how much he needs to see her. She advises him to move on. At this moment, the doorbell now buzzes, and it's Alice, who just finished working at a nearby coffee shop, coming to see Dan. He lets her up to the studio where she meets Anna. Alice's hair is now in its original medium brown color and is significantly longer. Dan departs to give the two of them some alone time as Alice asks Anna to take her picture. As she starts to take her picture, Alice says she was downstairs and heard their talk over the intercom. Anna looks aside and starts apologizing. Tears welling up in her eyes, Alice turns around and yells at Anna to snap the photo. A little while later, Dan is on his computer in his apartment. For laughs, he logged in as a lady in a sex chat room. On the internet, he meets Larry, another male. He logs on while working as a dermatologist and is also addicted to sex. When he requests Dan for a name, he tells him Anna. After they exchange some sultry and passionate letters, Dan proposes to see Larry in person, as a joke. He instructs him to meet him at the aquarium. By coincidence, Anna happens to be present when Larry visits the following day. As he gets closer to her, they realize that Dan is pulling a practical joke on him. He finds embarrassed, she finds him funny, and they click. After 4 months, Dan and Alice are preparing to see Anna's art show. We also find out that Dan's father recently passed away, and Dan is going to the funeral in the countryside after the art exhibition. Alice wants to accompany him and be there for him, but he wants to be alone himself. When they visit the show, they view the picture Anna took of Alice crying. As Alice looking at it, she meets Larry. After a little conversation during which Alice and Larry engage in some light flirting, revealing that Larry and Anna are dating and in a romantic relationship, when she approaches him, and greets Larry. Throughout their talk, Dan is obviously still smitten with Anna, who tells him and Alice how she and Larry met and how they refer to him as Cupid. We also find out that Dan is back to writing obituaries after his book failed. A short while later, Dan puts Alice in a taxi outside the building, and he pretends to be going straight to the funeral, but in reality, he returns to speak with Anna. 1 more year later. Upon entering his flat, Dan informs Alice that he has been attending a business dinner. At last, he acknowledges that he has been seeing Anna and that they have been having a romantic relationship since that night at the art show. At the same moment, Anna and Larry are in their apartment. Now that they are married, Larry has just returned from a vacation on business. She doesn't initially tell him anything. Larry confesses to sleeping with a prostitute while traveling, saying he can't bear to lie to her. After only telling him it's okay, it becomes apparent that she has been having an extramarital affair with Dan. In a fit of rage, Larry questions her decision to marry him. When she and Larry made the decision to be married, she claims she tried to break things up with Dan, but it just got worse. She provides Larry the specifics he requests about her and Dan. He orders her to go because he is so mad. Back to Dan's apartment, Alice is crying and distraught. Dan tries to console her and says he's sorry for causing her pain. After she exits the apartment, he doesn't know where she went. After half a year, Larry walks into a strip club for a drink and sees Alice, a stripper there who is dressed in a tiny top, a G-string, and a pink wig. He sets her up for a private dance in her room. She voluntarily hands him one. After grinning and flirting, as part of the performance, she then tells him her name is Jane Jones. Larry becomes agitated by his recent divorce proceedings from Anna, and distracted by Alice's playfulness and lack of interest in him. When he suggests to have a sexual encounter, she answers no. Afterwards, when he requests for a more intimate look at her, she complies. A couple of months later, Anna is rushing to a music concert to meet Dan. She says she's sorry for being late. As we find out when they sit down to enjoy a drink, she had met Larry earlier in the day to get him to sign the divorce papers. A few moments later, Dan correctly guesses that Anna slept with Larry that day. An earlier meeting with Larry involved him offering to sign the divorce documents in exchange for one last night with her. She was taken aback by the request, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Anna claims that she only gave her body to Larry in order to put an end to the whole situation. Dan is still furious. A few more months later, Dan barges into Larry's office and furiously tells him that Anna has returned to Larry. When Larry admits that Anna never actually filed the divorce papers, Dan tries to confront him and accuse him of being entirely to blame. She is back with Larry since she is a sadness junkie and is destined for unstable relationships, but he still loves her and wants to spend time with her. Larry is first upset with Dan, but as soon as he starts crying and seems genuinely hurt, Larry starts to feel sorry for him. When he orders Dan to return to Alice, Dan admits that he has no idea where she is. Larry informs him about the strip club, assuring him that he didn't sleep with Alice when he saw her there. As he is leaving, Larry admits to Dan that he did, in fact, sleep with Alice. Dan visits the strip club and notices Alice dancing on the stage. They both look at each other, as though they are pleased to see each other again. Alice is staying in a hotel room close to Heathrow Airport with Dan. They look incredibly content together. She's decided to treat him to a trip back to New York when she plans to visit. Alice remembers that it was this day 4 years ago that they first met on that street corner in London, and Dan says that time flies by so quickly. Dan asks Alice if she slept with Larry, and she answers him that she didn't. He insists on knowing the truth. He eventually exits the room to obtain cigarettes. On his way out, he turns back again and gives Alice a flower. And upon his return, asks Alice for the truth. She breaks the news to him that she no longer loves him. She tells him that's why she stopped loving him just now because he kept bringing up Larry. Finally, she acknowledges the truth. After running into each other at the strip club that evening, she and Larry did spend the night together. Dan informs her that he has known and already forgiven her. She advises him to leave because she is tired of him telling her that it doesn't matter and that he loves her. After she starts screaming at him, he slaps her. Shocked by this violent outburst, Dan exits the hotel room. Alice travels alone back to New York. Dan has stayed in London at the same time. As he walks past the park where they first met, Alice Ayres is one of the names on the wall that catches his attention. After Alice is returning to New York and going through immigration, we see that her passport actually bears Jane Jones's, the name she gave Larry after he had forced her for it in the strip club. Jane, or Alice, is seen strolling along a busy street in New York when she decides to cross the street against the "Don't Walk" sign. This action brings to mind the scene from the opening in which she was struck by a taxi while crossing the street carelessly in London and met Dan. Nevertheless, she has returned to her native nation to confront an uncertain future by herself. For more videos similar to this, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Thank you for watching.